Now on to the exciting piece. We will kick off the webinar with Jonathan Hugh. Jonathan is the Director of Technology for Global Vision. Jonathan oversees the research and development efforts for automated proofreading solutions for the pharmaceutical and consumer goods industries. Jonathan, thank you very much for joining us today, and I will hand the webinar over to you.
Thanks, Tara. So my session here in today's webinar is really to address and discuss challenges and technologies for label and packaging quality control. So some of the topics that we'll be covering include going over some typical errors in labeling and trying to understand what are the quality control challenges in the labeling process. And then we'll end off kind of the presentation with processes and recommendations and technologies to help reduce errors in labeling. So starting off with errors or typical errors in labeling. So looking at this slide here, a common or very common error that we see is spelling mistakes. So what we see here, we have the word referrals that's noted twice here. So one, in the first instance, we have one R, and the other one we have two. So which one is the correct one, even though they're applying or they're being shown in the same document, the actual one with the two R's is correct. So this is really to show you that spell checking is very important and spelling mistakes can happen. And why do they happen? It's because maybe you're not running spell checks on the source document. We do have tools in the spell check in Microsoft Word to spell check documents. Are we using those tools? Another point to consider is, are you running spell checks in your final label artwork? So when you are creating your PDF files with the artwork, do you run a spell check as part of your process? Another type of error that we see that's quite common include typesetting errors. So the example that I have here on screen, you can see the word not is repeated twice. So it's a double negative that you see here on screen. And this actually caused a recall in the marketplace. So why do things like this happen? So when you're dealing with artwork and your labeling process, you're dealing with source documents, you're dealing with the artwork, you're doing a lot of copy pasting between your sources to your destination. So when you're doing that typesetting process and transcribing text to the artwork, these types of errors can occur. And even though you are typically proofreading the source document versus the artwork, it's not that obvious that this word is repeated twice, especially if you have a lot of documents and artwork that you have to proofread from time to time. So here's another example of a typesetting error. So you can see clearly that the product itself is honey peanuts, and in this case the ingredients is listed as sunflower seeds. So again, this could be because of a copy paste error. It could be because we used the wrong source or source document, the wrong artwork that we used to start off with, or someone just forgot to change that text within the artwork. So another reason why do these happen, typesetting is very common, and I guess it's just a practice building up over the years. You can see, for example, here another example of a mistake in labeling, where the word lorem ipsum has been left in, and if you're a typesetter or a graphic artist, it's actually very common. The word lorem ipsum, it's actually simply dummy text of the printing and typesetting industry. So it's been the industry standard dummy text ever since the 1500s. And when an unknown printer took a galley of type and scrambled it to make a type specimen book. So since then, it's actually survived not only 5 centuries, but also it's leapt into electronic typesetting today. So it's remaining essentially unchanged. it was popularized in the 1960s, and a lot of desktop publishing software includes versions of this text, so you can kind of typeset and place some placeholder text in there. So I talked about text, but this also happens in your process or in the artwork process when you're dealing with barcodes as well. So you may not necessarily have the right barcodes to begin with, so a graphic artist can put a for placement only barcode just to show you that this is the type of barcode that I want in my label, and it should look similar to that, but it's actually not the final barcode. So more reasons why these types of issues happen. So again, it could be maybe the approved text is not yet received when you start conceiving the artwork. So you want to come up with the design of the artwork, but you don't have the final text. So I'll put some placeholder text, I'll put some barcodes in there just to get a look and feel of how my packaging is going to look. Another reason why these types of issues happen is because if I'm a graphic artist, I'm a graphic artist. I'm not a proofreader. So my job is to create the artwork, make it look nice, but not necessarily responsible for making sure that the content in my label is correct. And obviously, there's more and more products going out to market these days. You have more and more packaging labels that you have to deal with. Timelines are not getting any shorter. You're getting more work to do, maybe less resources to work on that too. So a lot of things happening all at the same time can contribute to these types of errors. You also have the issue with change requests, and how do you handle change requests in your process? Do you have a structured way to handle changes from different departments? So there's always changes from different countries, different locations. There's last-minute changes that can happen. So let's say you get a last-minute change from marketing that they need something removed right away from the packaging. So in theory, changes should be easy to make. I mean, I'm requesting a change to the graphic artist. It should be easy to make that change and get me a new version right away. So in practice, because there's so much stuff going on, how do you really guarantee that you're making the right changes as part of your change control, and that you're not making extra changes by mistake? So those are kind of like the typical errors that can occur in terms of the content, in terms of your labeling and packaging process. So really, how do these types of errors affect us? I mean, a mislabeling error can result in monetary costs. So relabeling is expensive operation, penalties that can arise from retail or even from government if you're dealing with a regulated industry. The reputation is important, that you don't want to have a mistake in your label. And then, I mean, causes for these errors, again, are tighter deadlines. You may have less resources to work with. Human error, so people get tired as well. There's a lot of work to do, too many change requests, lack of control and communication, and a lot of the departments being involved with the labeling process. So one of the statistics that we have is that actually 51% of food and drug recalls can be attributed to labeling errors. And just to guide you through maybe a typical process that you have to, again, illustrate the complexities of dealing with a label. I mean, you work with labels every day. You see labels and packaging. Looks like a simple process to get that, but there's actually a lot of departments involved. So dealing directly with the copy that you have to work with, let's say marketing and maybe the brand owner or brand manager for that product, dealing maybe with your legal department in terms of the artwork process, making sure that whatever you're putting on your labels meets regulatory requirements, and that the text has been approved, maybe by a regulatory body. You have to deal with a creative group, a graphics group, to now take that text and copy it over and create the design for the artwork. That may have to circulate back to marketing again with revisions, maybe to headquarters or your local country offices to revise the artwork again. Then you have to work with suppliers for production, where you send over the artwork to the production. Now they have to take care of creating proofs, creating prints, maybe putting the correct braille or barcodes if you're dealing with those components in your packaging and labeling process. You have to print, and then once you print, you have to QC that final print to just make sure that your final print matches the original concept that you have in terms of your label. So this is a very complex process, and there's a lot of room to make errors. So definitely there's recommendations that you can make on how you can improve a process, and how can we improve quality control for your labeling process. So I guess it's important to have in place some responsibility for content in labeling. So there's a lot of departments that are involved in your labeling process. So do you have a clear definition within your company who is responsible for the entire content, or are there departments responsible for specific parts of the content, and do they know that they are responsible for making those approvals and decisions? So you can have different departments like regulatory, marketing, label control, graphics, print suppliers who are involved in there, but it's important to define who is responsible for proofreading, who's responsible for the content, so that each person knows what they have to do to help contribute to better quality in your labeling process. Another thing that you can do as part of that is definition of checks or checklists in the process. So now that you know who's responsible for different aspects of the content in your packaging, maybe have SOPs or checklists that you use so that that person knows every time that I'm reviewing a piece of artwork or label that these are things that I need to check. It could be things like, did you run a spell check? Did you check the translations to make sure that they are correct for my market? And are the graphics correct? Do I have maybe the correct graphics on them? Are there any warning graphics that I need to have on my label? Things like that. And again, more on the front of standardization and making easier in terms of your process for QC. How about implementing standards for your copy documents? So your source documents where you contain the text. Do you guys use Word, XML, Excel as your source document? I know I deal with a lot of customers where they do, but they have a mix of different source documents, and each document actually looks quite different in terms of the format. So imagine a graphic artist having to deal with different types of Word documents. Then you have to look every time in different spots to do your copy-paste into your final artwork. So having also a template in place in terms of your copy documents makes it easier for graphic artists or operator to follow and make sure that we're copying the right sections within the text into the artwork. Things to consider also in terms of translations could be, how do I organize translations within my source document as well? Do I want to have different pages for each language? Or do I want to mix all the languages into all the sections? So having a mix of different languages could cause error if it's all defined in the same section and you're mixing up different languages as part of your process. Things that you can also do in terms of standardization in the process also could be to review some of the standards that you use for PDF files. So using layers in PDF to make it easier for review. So as an operator, I could actually open a file and just check off the different layers and review those kind of like a checklist as well to make sure that the artwork is created properly. I can also make sure that text is preserved, or I might want to tag my documents, use the right fonts within my PDFs as well. So make sure that everyone's using the same fonts within the company, and also standardizing on the graphic software to create these files. So you want to make sure that you don't have any compatibility issues by having different versions that can corrupt your files in there. And then you want to also define where you want to perform your QC checks. So verify text copy, checking revisions. Do you want to check your proofs? Do you want to check 1-bit TIFF plates? Do you want to check print? So those are things to consider. Where do you want to implement your checks? And the final recommendation here is, how can you use technology to help with your quality control? So if you're facing challenges with managing text, managing copy, well, you can look into solutions, technologies for text management. If you're looking for solutions for revision documents and controlling those, there's artwork management systems that can help you manage all the files that you have to deal with on a daily basis. There's software also to manage translation. So if you have common terms that need to be translated as part of your labeling process, there's software for that. There's also tools for automated proofreading to help you compare documents, check barcodes, so that you can catch errors early on. So finishing off the presentation, just to show you, I mean, using the recommendations in terms of checklist, technology, you could actually achieve very electronic workflow, for example, where I can submit 2 documents. So the master document where, let's say, I've requested a bunch of changes that have been made to the graphic artist, and the graphic artist comes back with a revised file. And I just want to make sure, using checklists, that all the changes that I requested were made. So what I can do is I can load the file. Compare the files, and you can see visually like what the differences are using technology. And if you can organize yourself with a checklist, I can kind of go through a checklist of items that I need to check and verify against the changes that have been made with the graphic artist. So for example, it says should say Global Vision 8 for my barcode. I can easily check the barcode as well. So an example of this is of how technology can help you. So that is actually the end of my presentation, and I'll pass it back to Tara to move on to the next session.
Great. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Just a reminder to everyone to please feel free to send in any questions, and we will address them at the end of the webinar. So I'm very pleased to introduce our next presenter, Jackie Leslie. Jackie is the Director of Process Consulting for Blue Software. Jackie works with companies who are exploring ways to gain better control over their brand content. Jackie, thank you very much for joining us today, and the ball is yours.
Thank you, Tara. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to talk to you about disrupting the process, and what we're going to cover today is a number of things, but we're going to do it very quickly. We're going to talk about how you need to break the artwork process to make it better. We're going to talk about why your current process leaves you exposed to potential issues. We're going to cover a little bit of how to disrupt the process and align to a new innovative way of working. And then lastly, we're going to cover how do you get there. So just to start off, when most of us think about the word disruption, I think we often view it in a kind of a negative connotation. But I'm going to talk about it in a more positive way today. So what we're looking at here, Steven Sinofsky created this diagram on the 4 stages of disruption, and he said that innovation and disruption are the hallmarks of the technology industry. Now, he's an ex-Microsoft VP, so his focus is probably obviously going to be on technology. Another person who's written a lot about this notion of disruptive innovation is a man by the name of Clayton Christensen. And his view is that disruption is a necessary part of innovation and growth. And he didn't just apply the theory to technology, he also included processes and services in that statement. So if we look at the diagram in that context, the first stage would be the disruption stage, and we're introducing a product or a service or a new way of working into an organization. And then the evolution, stage 2, is to rapidly innovate along this new way of working. Stage 3 then would be the convergence stage, which is really looking at the value proposition of what you've just introduced into the organization and looking at that value proposition compared to your legacy way of working. And then the fourth stage, called reimagination in this diagram, is really just putting into place what was originally this disruption into your organization. So we're going to talk about this in the next 10 minutes here about this disruption in terms of a new way of working to manage your content for your labels. So let's first touch on why your current process leaves you exposed. And so if you think about the content that's required on a label, where are the potential leaks in the current state? So that's what we're talking about here. And the first one, and maybe the most obvious one, is all of these manual touch points. And Jonathan touched on this as well when he was speaking. There's a lot of people who are involved in this process, and there's a lot of manual touch points along the way. So if you think about when you create your labels right from concept to getting them out to market, if you think about all of the people who either provide copy or content, approve that content or that label or the copy document, and then all of the people that touch it along the way, there's a pretty high number of people involved in that process. And then lastly, again, as Jonathan stated, it's a complex process. You know, very few companies work with one brand or one product in one country. So when you start thinking about your entire portfolio and all of the languages and markets and countries that you work in, it very quickly becomes a complex process to manage all of that content. So here's an example. And in the middle here, we have a number of different copy statements. And these copy statements, depending on what sector you're in and what products you have, these statements might be different for you. But the main point here is that they typically are collected through Word documents and Excel documents and maybe email messages. And you have all of these different people involved in the process. And then through this collation of all this information, you have what I'll refer to as these heroic coordinators who are basically collecting all of this information, and then out the end of this comes all of these copy documents. And typically what we see is that it's a one-to-one relationship. For every item or product or SKU that you have, there's probably going to be one copy document that goes with it. So again, it takes a lot of effort to make sure that you've got all of the right copy and that it's all approved and all of the right people have seen it on those copy documents. And then the stakeholders. So if you think about all of the people that need to touch or approve the copy document or the artwork, R&D might be involved in new product commercialization, the initiation process or redesigns. In pharmaceutical companies, it's often the regulatory group who is initiating product label changes. And then we have all of these other parties. You've got your designers, maybe some external agencies you work with, quality groups, pack engineering, and so on. So again, lots of different touch points, both for the copy document and ultimately the label. And so if we look at this another way, starting with the copy document, we typically go through 3 approval cycles when we're managing artwork. So the first would be artwork creation. And at artwork creation stage, in most organizations, how that copy gets onto the artwork is through a cut and a paste. So that's a manual touch point. And so once the copy is on the artwork, we go through the art creation cycle, and then we go into pre-press and so on. And at any stage in the process, a change could be necessary, hopefully not in pre-press and print stage, but before the label is released, you might go through a couple of cycles in the artwork creation stage where changes are necessary. And often what we see is that those changes don't necessarily always make it back into the copy document, into that starting source. They often are done directly on the artwork, especially if it's a last-minute change or if it's an emergency and you're running to a tight timeline. So then what that causes is that you end up with your system of record being the pack. So a year from now, if you need to make a change to this label, your starting point may in fact be the label that's already out in the marketplace. You may not go back to that copy document as your starting point. So now you're having to very obviously tightly control your version control on the labels and make sure that your starting point is always that most up-to-date label. Now, this new way of working would introduce this notion of a database that's managing that copy for you. So your database becomes your system of record, and you're no longer relying on making sure that you're tracking those labels and using those as your starting point. And there's many benefits to that. So in this model, if we think about aligning to this new way of working, under the current state, then we see our copy statements that come in through these different methods, and then they end up on these copy documents that get pushed into the artwork. And then on the right-hand side of this page, we see the future state, which is all of your copy statements neatly lined up in a database and all of your stakeholders interacting with the database. Now, theoretically, this might look easy, but the reality is this kind of change is extremely disruptive to a business. There's a lot of stakeholders involved. They're very probably comfortable with the current way of working. And most importantly, when you introduce a change into this process, any kind of change is going to introduce risk. So there's a number of reasons why this is a very disruptive thing to put into your business. And it requires heavy change management to make sure that everybody's moving to this model when an organization does change. And we're not necessarily talking about the copy document going away, because a lot of companies rely on their copy documents. We're just talking about maybe thinking about it a little bit differently, and that the copy document could just be a byproduct of the information that's kept in the database, but people are actually interacting with the database through some kind of nice UI that they can manage this copy in. So then if we take this a step further, what we would be talking about here is having the copy database feed the artwork. And so where we talked about this being a manual cut and paste in the more traditional method, what we would have happen here is that the copy would automatically be applied into the artwork once it's approved in the database or in the system. So you'd remove that manual touch point, and then we're maybe never going to get to the place where no changes would happen beyond the artwork creation stage. But if we did, then ideally what you would say happening here is that the copy would be updated in the database and then automatically feed back into the artwork. So we're talking about a couple of things needing to be in place here. Not only would the copy need to be in the database, but the artwork would have to have the logic in it to be able to understand where the copy needs to go and how it flows together with everything else on the artwork itself. And then ultimately with this model, we could even move into a world where if a change is made on the artwork, it automatically updates the database from the artwork. And with that kind of a model, especially with the pharmaceutical practice, you would need to make sure that you've got very tight controls over when those updates happen in the artwork and how they feed back and who can do that and who needs to approve it and so on. But technically, you know, this is really where we see the model potentially heading, is where we have this notion of round tripping of data so that you can keep track of everything, and you've always got that synchronization between the copy database and the actual artwork that it sits on. So another key piece of this equation is, I'll call it this power of one to many. And if you see in the middle of the page here, we have this ingredient panel. And this ingredient panel, or it could be a claim statement or a product description or storage instructions, whatever the case is, but this statement could be used in multiple regions. You could have it translated in multiple languages across different sizes of your products and across different lines. But it could be the same statement being used on all of these artwork. So now one of the big values of the database model is that you can quickly do an impact analysis So you can identify just by looking in one place in a system that this ingredient statement is used on 25 artwork. So now you can very quickly say, okay, what's the impact of me making a change to this statement? Should I do it now, or should I wait for another regulatory change that's coming? So it gives you more information to make those decisions that you need to make to manage your portfolio of products. So why do this? What's the payback of introducing this kind of disruption into your business? The first is the manual touch points. I don't think that we're anywhere close to getting to eliminating the quality checks and balances that we have in place, and those tools will still be needed. What we're trying to do here, though, is to reduce potential issues from being introduced into your process. So the more manual touch points you eliminate, the higher quality you just build into your process. And then managing that single source of truth, having that place where you know that the latest approved copy that's your system of record. There's a lot of value in having that trust and that truth in one place. And then just by default, if you do introduce the first two bullets, then you will get speed. You'll get better speed to market because you'll have fewer cycles, fewer reviews, and things that need to be done on the artwork. And then lastly, the copy consistency. If you get to a model where you have that one ingredient statement or that claim statement in one place in a database instead of on 20 Word documents, then you have a much better way of managing your copy, and you can quickly do that impact analysis. And just getting over back to the image here, back to the water theme. This image is these heroic coordinators who can now take a break because they're on holiday, because they're all caught up on managing their copy. So if you do think that this would be worth exploring for your business, here's some very high-level 3 steps. How do you dip your toe in the water in this? How would you move forward with this kind of concept? And the first is the business case. So this is really taking a look at what would drive this for your business. Where are the benefits of why it would make sense for you to embark on this kind of disruption into your organization? Is it regulatory driven, which may be the case, and with pharmaceutical, that would be a primary reason to introduce this. Is it consistency across your labels? Is it a need to have a lower cycle time in your artwork? So there's a number of different things that can drive this. And one of the things that we often see with the business case is that regulatory ends to be a primary participant in this process, and often even a sponsor in this process, because a lot of the copy is owned or controlled by the regulatory team. So they're really key to implementing or deploying something like this. The second is business practices, and there's a number of tools and technologies and techniques in the marketplace that will help with this kind of a model. We use a process called an every square inch review, and that's simply going through your labels and identifying each of the different types of copy on the labels across your portfolio of labels. Where are the different copy statements used, and where are they different, and where should they be the same? Who owns each of those copy elements? Who needs to approve it? Where do they come from? So it's really an analysis on your products and on your copy, and trying to determine where is a good place for us to start, where would you get value from this type of a model, and so on. So there's a number of things in the marketplace that can help with some best practices. And then the third is the operational change. And so if you do decide to go down this road once you've done the business case and you've looked at your different options of what's available in the market, the operational change is a big one here because of the disruptive nature of what we're talking about. And so having the leadership and the sponsorship and the ownership of driving this into the business, and also the roadmap of how you do this. There's a number of different ways to approach this type of initiative. We would probably typically recommend that you start with some small wins and then build on those disruptive successes so that you have some learnings along the way and you can introduce it in a more stable way as you move forward. And that's it for me. So if you are interested in this topic or want to learn more about it, visit us at our website, and we'd love to talk to you more about this. This is we're very passionate about this subject at Blue, and we think it's really a way forward for the industry. So I will pass it back to Tara and on to our next speaker. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Jackie. Just a reminder again to anyone who has any questions, just feel free to send them in and we can address them at the end of the webinar. Last but certainly not least, I'm happy to introduce Andrew Love. Andrew is a Vice President and Consultant at B-Forward. He is a multi-award-winning packaging and artwork management strategist, leader, and author. You may be familiar with Andrew as he and Stephen McIndow are some of the key contributors on our Leaders in Labeling group. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tara, and I hope everybody can see my screen. So, good morning and good afternoon. I get the pleasure of wrapping this up to some degree, and I hope you found both Jonathan and Leslie's presents interesting. What I'm going to talk about is, again, labeling and artwork from our perspective to see kind of how it fits with what the two speakers have said before. So, artwork is an essential part of packaging and labeling. It's not necessarily the most critical thing that goes on in your company, but it's something that's very, very important for how you're moving forward. An example that we've got in the middle here is an example that happened to me in my career where we expected the artwork to be saying 1/3 tablets per day. The artwork actually said 13 tablets per day. That was not good. It was
Andrew,
an immediate. Yeah.
Am
I not sharing my screen? Am I
no,
not sharing my screen here?
Sorry.
That's a bit weird. Hang on a second. We'll see what we can do here because I'm seeing it, but it's not coming up.
You have two screens.
The joys of technology. And I'm not sure why it's not doing it. Let me just do something else here.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Are you seeing that?
Yeah.
Seeing that in presentation mode now. Excellent. Okay, sorry about that, folks. Let me come back to where we were. So, an example in my previous life, the artwork should have said 1/3 tablets per day. The artwork actually said 1/3 tablets per day. That was an immediate and fatal dose. So the impact of having labeling wrong is significant. Patients rely on it being correct, and I'm sure all of you out there are very passionate about making sure that the labeling from your company is correct. But it still remains one of the highest recalls across the industry. And regularly we're talking to people about issues that they've had, and it puzzles companies about why, you know, as Jonathan said, we've been putting text onto card for hundreds of years. Why do we still get this wrong? So I think if you look at what's happening, and Leslie touched on this slightly, to create an artwork, you're collating many different pieces of information from many different parts of the organization. And the provenance of this information has to be correct through all of those different channels. So in some cases, the way that it's controlled in companies is extremely high. So if you think of your component numbers, or what I would call your item numbers, they'll be in your ERP system. There'll be very strict GMP controls for managing those. And the ability to get those into the artwork team is a very structured and controlled process typically. However, if we think about maybe price that's got to be put on some packs in some markets, what's the process for how that price is agreed in a local market, and how is that communicated through to the artwork teams? So it's not just about the core pieces of information, it's about any piece of information that goes onto artwork. And there are obviously many opportunities for error in trying to do that. If you then look at the process, so what we typically see when we go into any company is you have an artwork process. And at a high level, as we show here, the artwork processes are typically pretty standard. It's very difficult to create the artwork if you haven't got the text. It's very difficult to go and implement the new component if you haven't got it printed. So there is a logical order for doing things. But what we often see is that there are not clear, defined control points between each of these stages where the information is thoroughly checked and approved formally before you move on to the next step. So we see many cases where errors are detected in the source text when the artwork is being proofread. But do you go back and update your source text thoroughly? And what do you do to try and make sure that your source text is correct before it gets into the artwork phase? So what we would say is having a structured process is critical, but on top of that, having the right control points in the right place with the right people reviewing and approving at those control points is what makes a process more thorough. So most companies have got processes, but what we often find when we go out to look at companies is that there are. So what we often find is that people have got their processes in place, but they're lacking what we would call the underpinning capabilities that support those processes and make them work effectively. So things that we would include in that would be things like their ability to capabilities. What we typically see with clients is that you've got a clear process, but what's lacking is what we call a series of underpinning capabilities that I'm showing here. So the underpinning capabilities that we would talk about are things like how you manage your process documentation, how you manage the work that's coming into your department and make sure that that's executed properly. The management of service providers, and you can see along the bottom here another set of areas. So people tend to have the process in place, but they're lacking these capabilities. So what I'm going to do just in the last few minutes that we've got is have a look at a few of these capabilities and talk about them in a little bit more detail. So work management. You could think of an artwork operation as a bit like a factory. It produces a product, which is an artwork PDF. It has a demand, it has a capacity, it has a workload that it's got to meet, and it's got a production schedule that it's got to do. So how well are you forecasting the demand that you've got and understanding what's going to be coming into that department in the future? How well are you planning the individual jobs that you're having to do and making sure that all the people that are involved in those jobs are able to do the work at the time that they need to do it to support the schedule for that plan? And then how well do you monitor execution to make sure that things are done? So what I often find when I go out and talk to people is they've got loads of work in progress, but it's very difficult for them to know exactly where things are unless they've got tools in place that allow them to do that scheduling. Next, this picture is a bit similar to the one that Leslie put up earlier about the different groups that are involved. But I think the way that I would look at this slide is that many of the people that are involved in the process are critical for the process to be successful, but they don't do the activity very often. So if you think of a typical regulatory affiliate out in one of your markets, they've got many things that they need to do on a day-to-day basis. Labeling an artwork is a small percentage of their activity, but it's something that's very critical for how they do properly. So how do you make sure, first of all, that the people who are all over the organization involved in this process are able to do the job successfully through having the right training and education to know what to do? And then how do you also make sure that they've got enough time to be able to do the jobs that they need to do? So I hear very often when I talk to people in the markets that, oh yeah, we get a file sent to us at 5 o'clock on a Friday night, and then 15 minutes later someone's on the phone saying, why haven't you approved this yet? Because we need to get it out to the print supplier. So this broad group of people who get involved occasionally in the process are key for the success of the process, but it's very difficult to keep them engaged and up to speed in how to do those things successfully. Third area that I would pull out is around IT. We've obviously heard from both Blue and Global Vision this morning. What we've got here is a large range of different parts of IT capabilities that build up the suite that's necessary to support this area. And I think what we often see is companies get bigger, get more global, your volumes increase. You can't manage it anymore by what's been considered in the past to be the artwork management system, which is Microsoft Outlook. You can't do this by email in a big scale. So it's important to have the right tools in place. Some of these tools form an artwork management system, so things like document management, electronic approval, your planning and scheduling. Some of these tools are specific desktop tools that people need to be able to create the artwork, for example. And then some of them, like submission management, are how you engage with your regulatory authorities around the world to be able to submit into their electronic systems. So there's many different parts of the toolkit that you need to look at here. Not all of those need to be from one vendor, and in most cases you probably couldn't get them all from one vendor, but it's important to put that technology together in a way that supports your organization as you move forward. What we typically see is companies moving through 3 levels of capability. So at a first level, it's about getting control. It's about having compliant processes. It's about having those key control points in place. It's about getting stuff out to the market on time. Whilst you can do that, it's not necessarily efficient and effective. So you can do that with lots of running around and lots of noise, but the next step of capability really is starting to be able to plan effectively and use your resources effectively. And then that leads through to a final point, which is achieving world class. Now, not everybody needs to be at that level. And many companies that I talk to say efficient and effective is just fine for us. If we've got a good back office process here, then we're quite happy. But what we do need as an industry is some people who are leading the way. Nobody necessarily wants to be on the leading edge, but everybody wants to be the fast follower. So we don't all need to be world class, but it's important that some people are there. So finally, and to close out this part of the presentation, we still see that packaging and artwork is a significant compliance risk. There are capabilities out there that can resolve that, and many companies have gone through that journey. And it's important to be going through that journey because the expectation of the regulators is moving all the time as they watch companies get their labeling and artwork under control. Leslie talked about a few ways of moving forward. I would break the first piece of that down into clearly understanding what you have first, and then the gap analysis against where you would want to be so that you can put in a clear plan for how you would like to move forward. So that, with a little bit of technology problem in the middle there, completes the present that I was wanting to do. Tara, I'll hand it back through to you.
Great. Excuse me. Thank you very much, Andrew. Again, I'd like to give my sincere thanks to our presenters, Jonathan Hugh, Jackie, Leslie, and Andrew Love. I'd also like to thank all of you for taking time out of your day to join us. Again, we have a couple of questions come in, but if you do have any questions, please feel free just to enter them in the chat box. And we will get to our first question. So our first question is for Jackie. You talked about process disruption. Do you encourage a company to look at looking at disrupting their process before system design?
Yeah, that's a great question, and the answer is yes, absolutely. There's always looking at the process before you go ahead and decide what you're going to deploy is a critical piece that we would always recommend. Every company's at a different stage in this process, as Andrew was just describing, and so starting with the current state process and where there might be some opportunities to make some changes is always the place that we would recommend starting in.
Great, thank you. The next question we have here is for Jonathan. How do you get the biggest return on investment when looking at proofing tools?
Thanks, Tara. Yeah. So in terms of the biggest benefit or return on investment for proofing tools, I think the key thing, I guess I discussed in my presentation, is you have a lot of people who are working on the artwork. So people who have different responsibilities. So I think the first step is to define who's responsible for content in the proofreading and implementing it in the correct process, so defining those points. So the key thing for the ROI is accessibility. So the more people who have access, let's say through a web-based proofing tool, the more checks you can have in place. So you can define, I guess, specific checks for regulatory, for artwork and graphics, for proof, vendor proofs, and for print supplier print production. And introducing proofing tools throughout those 4 key processes, I think that's where you'll get the biggest benefit, because you're going to have different checkpoints that cover the different areas of where the artwork can go wrong.
Okay, great. Thank you. And the last question I'll send to you, Andrew. You talked about that integrated process and how labeling and artwork has many different areas. How do you get a company to look across the organization and not just within their functions?
I think the key thing there is, first of all, making sure that you've got the right sponsorship in place, and then getting the correct cross-functional governance team. It's very difficult for an artwork team to reach out horizontally into the organization to try and get other areas to be involved or improved. It's much easier to make sure that on your governance team you've got all the right functions involved, and that they're taking the ownership of resolving the issues in their part of the process. I think the challenge is that artwork is one of the few truly cross-functional processes in an organization. So it's very difficult to get everybody involved. And most companies struggle to work cross-functionally. But work on that governance team and get the governance team working would be my first piece of advice.
Okay, thank you very much. So we're coming up on time here. If there are any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to our presenters. We heard today from Jonathan about using technology to support proofing and really understanding where in the process to best leverage these tools. Jackie spoke about not being afraid to disrupt your current processes and to embrace the opportunity, and also to look at starting with some small wins. And we just heard from Andrew where he talked about really excellent is linked to that big integrated process, forecasting, planning, and execution across the organization. So I want to thank again to all of you for attending, and to our presenters for taking the time and providing us with their thoughtful insights. And we wish you all the best, and we look forward to our next webinar in the fall. If anyone has any suggestions, would like to present a topic or has some suggestions on topics, please feel free to reach out to me through Leaders in Labeling. And I wish you all the best in your day and the upcoming weekend.